What if I told you that behind one of the world's most magnificent archaeological discoveries lies a story of unimaginable human suffering? What dark secrets were buried alongside thousands of clay warriors for over 2 millennia? And what would it have been like to be one of the countless workers who created this marvel, knowing that your life meant nothing to the emperor who demanded perfection? Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the fascinating, often overlooked details of our past that help us understand the human experience across time. I'm your host, and whether you're settling in for the night or just looking for some peaceful historical storytelling, you're in the right place. Before we begin our journey to ancient China, I'd love to know where you're checking in from tonight and what time it is there. Are you watching from your cozy bedroom in London at midnight? Perhaps you're in New York winding down after a long day. Or maybe you're on the other side of the world in Tokyo, taking a quiet moment for yourself. Drop a comment and let me know. I genuinely love hearing from our global community. If you find yourself truly enjoying these boring history stories, if they help you relax or learn something new, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. But only if you genuinely enjoy what we're doing here. I'd much rather have a smaller community of people who are truly engaged than numbers for the sake of numbers. Speaking of our community, you're such an important part of what we're building here. Your comments, your suggestions, your simple presence, it all matters. So please, let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or just check in and say hello. Whether you're a regular viewer or this is your first time here, thank you for your continued support. Now, as we prepare to journey back over 2,000 years to ancient China, you might want to get comfortable. Turn those lights down low, maybe put a fan on for some gentle background noise. We're going to spend the next 2 hours exploring one of history's most incredible discoveries, and the human stories behind it. Tonight, we're uncovering the terrifying secrets behind the Terracotta Army. But we're not just talking about the warriors themselves. We're going to explore what it was really like for the hundreds of thousands of people who created them, the emperor who ordered their construction, the mysteries that still baffle archaeologists today, and the incredible world of ancient Chinese imperial power. Why you wouldn't last a day building the Terracotta Army. Picture this. It's 221 BCE, and you're a craftsman living in what we now know as China. The Warring States period has just ended, and for the first time in centuries, all of China is united under one ruler. His name is Qin Shi Huang, and he's not just any emperor, he's the first emperor of unified China. You might think this sounds like the beginning of a golden age, but you'd be wrong. Because this emperor has a vision that will consume the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, including possibly yours. You wake up before dawn in your small, cramped quarters. The air is thick with dust and the smell of clay and smoke. Around you, dozens of other workers are stirring, preparing for another day of back-breaking labor. You've been working on what will become known as the Terracotta Army for 3 years now. And you know you'll be working on it until the day you die. There is no retirement plan, no vacation time, no weekend rest. This is your life now. The scale of what you're part of is almost incomprehensible. The emperor hasn't just ordered a few statues for his tomb. He's demanded an entire army, thousands upon thousands of life-sized warriors, horses, chariots, and weapons. Each one must be unique, each one must be perfect, and each one must be completed according to his exact specifications. The emperor believes that in death, he'll need this army to protect him in the afterlife, to maintain his power even beyond the grave. As you stumble to your feet, your body protests. Your back aches constantly from hunching over clay forms. Your hands are permanently stained and cracked from working with wet clay day after day. The constant exposure to kill smoke has left you with a persistent cough that you know will never go away. But complaining isn't an option. Workers who complain disappear. Workers who make mistakes disappear. Workers who try to escape disappear. You make your way to the work area, a vast complex of workshops and kilns that stretches as far as the eye can see. Thousands of workers like you are already at their stations. The organization is military in its precision. There are craftsmen who specialize in heads, others who focus on torsos, still others who work exclusively on hands or feet. There are experts in armor details, weapon makers, and painters who add the finishing touches. And watching over all of you are the overseers, men with whips and sharp eyes who ensure that the Emperor's vision is being realized exactly as he demands. Your specialty is facial features. You're one of the sculptors responsible for ensuring that no two warriors look exactly alike. The Emperor has decreed that his Terracotta Army must be as diverse as a real army, and so you spend your days creating unique faces, each one requiring hours of meticulous work. You shape cheekbones and jawlines, carve out eye sockets and nostrils, create the subtle differences in expression that will make each warrior appear alive. But here's what makes your job truly terrifying. You know that your work is being watched not just for quality, but for any sign of subversion. In an empire where the Emperor is considered divine, where his word is absolute law, even a sculptor's choice of facial expression can be seen as political commentary. Make a warrior's expression too stern, and it might be seen as criticism of the Emperor's harsh rule. Make it too gentle, and it might be interpreted as weakness. You've learned to create faces that are neutral, dignified, but not so expressive that they could be misinterpreted. The clay you work with isn't just any clay. It's been specially prepared, mixed with specific additives to ensure it will survive the firing process and remain intact for millennia. But working with this clay is harsh on your body. The constant moisture wreaks havoc on your skin, and the chemical additives leave a bitter taste in your mouth that never goes away. Your fingernails have long since been worn down to nothing from the constant scraping and shaping. The kilns where the warriors are fired operate at temperatures that would seem impossible for the time period. The heat is so intense that workers regularly collapse from exhaustion. The firing process takes days, and the kilns must be tended around the clock. You've seen men suffer severe burns from accidents, and you know that medical care is minimal at best. If you're injured badly enough that you can't work, you're simply replaced. What makes the working conditions even more unbearable is the secrecy surrounding the project. You're not allowed to leave the work complex. You're not allowed to send messages to your family. You're not even allowed to discuss the details of what you're creating with workers in other specialties. The Emperor's tomb is to be his greatest secret, and anyone who might reveal that secret is a liability. Food is basic and monotonous. Rice, some vegetables, occasionally a bit of meat. Just enough to keep you alive and working, but not enough to keep you strong or healthy. You've watched fellow workers grow thin and weak, their bodies slowly wearing down under the constant strain. Disease spreads quickly in the cramped quarters, and when someone falls ill, they're quickly isolated, not out of care for their well-being, but to prevent the illness from spreading and disrupting the work schedule. The psychological pressure is perhaps even worse than the physical hardships. You're constantly aware that you're expendable. The Emperor has made it clear that the completion of his tomb complex is more important than any individual life. There are always more workers available, always more craftsmen who can be conscripted or forced into service. You've seen quotas missed and entire workshops punished collectively. You've witnessed the execution of foremen who failed to meet deadlines. But it's not just the threat of punishment that weighs on you. It's the knowledge of what you're really creating. This isn't just an army of statues. It's intended to be a functional military force in the afterlife. The Emperor genuinely believes that these clay warriors will come to life after his death, that they'll serve him in the next world just as his human armies serve him in this one. The weapons they carry are real, sharpened bronze swords and spears that could easily kill. The attention to detail in their armor isn't just artistic flourish, it's military accuracy. And then there are the rumors, whispered stories about what else is being built in the Emperor's tomb complex. You've heard talk of rivers of mercury, of booby traps, designed to kill anyone who might try to enter the tomb. You've heard that the Emperor plans to take not just an army with him to the afterlife, but servants, concubines, even his horses. The implications of these rumors are terrifying because you know that in the Emperor's mind, the living and the dead are all equally his to command. The work never stops. Even when you're so exhausted you can barely stand, even when your hands are shaking from fatigue, even when you're sick, the work continues. The Emperor is aging, and everyone knows that the tomb must be completed before his death. This adds an element of frantic urgency to everything. Deadlines are moved up, work hours are extended, and the pressure intensifies with each passing month. You're part of something that historians will one day call one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. But you don't know that. All you know is that you're trapped in a nightmare of endless labor, creating something that may never be seen by human eyes again. The Emperor's tomb is designed to be sealed forever, and everyone who works on it understands that their life's work will be buried with him. The worst part is that you're not even sure if you'll live to see the project completed. Workers die regularly from exhaustion, accidents, and disease. But even if you survive the construction, there's no guarantee you'll be allowed to leave. The Emperor's paranoia about secrecy means that anyone who knows too much about the tomb's construction is a potential threat. You've heard whispers that when the tomb is finally sealed, the workers who built it will be sealed inside with it, ensuring that the Emperor's secrets die with them. This is what it meant to be a craftsman in the service of China's first emperor. This is the human cost behind one of the world's most magnificent archaeological treasures. Every perfectly crafted warrior, every intricately detailed piece of armor, every carefully sculpted face represents hours of human suffering, creativity constrained by fear, and lives sacrificed to serve one man's vision of eternal power. As you work on yet another warrior's face, shaping the clay with hands that will never be clean again, you can't help but wonder if anyone will ever know the price that was paid to create this underground army. You can't imagine that over 2,000 years later, people will marvel at the craftsmanship while knowing little about the craftsman who created it. You can't foresee that your suffering will be forgotten while your work endures. But your work will endure, and in that endurance, there's a strange kind of immortality. Every face you've shaped, every detail you've crafted, will outlast empires, outlast dynasties, outlast the very civilization that enslaved you to create it. In the end, perhaps that's a kind of victory, even if it's one you'll never live to see. The daily rhythm of work in the Emperor's workshop complex follows a pattern as rigid as the military formations your clay warriors will eventually stand in. You wake in the darkness before dawn, roused by the harsh voices of overseers who walk through the sleeping quarters with sticks, striking anyone who doesn't rise immediately. There's no gradual awakening, no gentle transition from sleep to consciousness. One moment you're desperately trying to find rest, despite your aching body, and the next you're on your feet, joining the shuffling mass of workers heading toward the work areas. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is consumed standing up. A bowl of thin rice gruel, perhaps with a few wilted vegetables floating in it, and a piece of coarse bread that's more sawdust than grain. You eat quickly, not because you're hungry, though you always are, but because the overseers allow only a few minutes for this meal. Anyone still eating when the work bell sounds receives a beating. You've learned to swallow the food almost without chewing, ignoring the way it sits heavy and uncomfortable in your stomach. The walk to your workstation takes you past thousands of other workers, each moving to their assigned areas with the mechanical precision of people who have repeated this journey countless times. You pass the kilns, already belching smoke into the morning air, tended by workers whose faces are permanently blackened by soot. You pass the clay preparation areas, where other workers knead and mix the special formulations that will become warrior bodhis. You pass the weapons forges, where the clash of hammers on bronze creates a constant percussion that never stops, day or night. Your workstation is a small area, barely larger than a sleeping mat, where you have your tools, your clay, and your reference materials. The reference materials are crucial and terrifying in equal measure. They consist of drawings and sometimes actual human skulls that show the range of facial types you're expected to recreate. The presence of real skulls raises questions you've learnt not to ask. Where did they come from? Were they taken from executed criminals, from defeated enemies, from workers who failed to meet their quotas? The skulls sit there, silent witnesses to your work, their empty eye sockets watching as you shape clay into faces that might outlast them by millennia. The process of creating a single warrior's head takes several days of intense, focused work. You begin with a rough clay form, building up the basic structure of the skull, the jaw, the cheekbones. This initial stage requires physical strength, forcing the clay into shape, smoothing out air bubbles that could cause the piece to explode in the kiln. Your hands move with practiced efficiency, but every movement causes pain. The repetitive motions have given you what the workers call clay hands, a condition where your joints swell and stiffen, making it increasingly difficult to do the fine detail work your specialty requires. Once the basic form is established, you move to the features. This is where your skill truly matters, and where the danger of making a mistake becomes most acute. The eyes must be shaped just right, deep enough to hold the paint that will be applied later, but not so deep that they create weak points in the structure. The nose must be strong and well proportioned, capable of surviving the firing process and the weight of centuries. The mouth, perhaps the most challenging feature, must be shaped with subtle detail that suggests personality without being so expressive that it could be interpreted as making a political statement. You've developed tricks over the years to speed up your work without sacrificing quality. You keep small tools fashioned from bone and wood that allow you to create specific textures and details quickly. You've learned exactly how wet the clay needs to be at each stage of the process. You've memorized the feel of clay that's perfectly prepared versus clay that will crack or warp during firing. But these efficiencies only mean that your quotas increase. The overseers notice when workers become more productive, and they adjust expectations accordingly. The social dynamics among the workers are complex and constantly shifting. On one level, you're all in this together, all suffering under the same impossible conditions. But on another level, you're competing for survival. Workers who consistently meet their quotas receive slightly better food rations. Workers who create pieces that are praised by the inspectors sometimes receive small privileges, like an extra hour of sleep or a day without beatings. This creates an atmosphere of desperate competition where friendships are rare and alliances are temporary. You've witnessed what happens to workers who fail repeatedly. First, they're moved to less skilled positions, assigned to tasks like carrying clay or cleaning workspaces. If they continue to fail, they simply disappear one night, and no one mentions them again. Their sleeping space is immediately filled by a new worker, and it's as if they never existed. This system of erasure is perhaps more terrifying than outright execution would be. It suggests that individual human lives matter so little that they're not even worth acknowledging. The inspections are the most stressful part of your day. Several times each day, officials walk through the workshops, examining the work in progress. These aren't the overseers who supervise the day-to-day labor, but higher-ranking officials who report directly to the project administrators. They carry tablets where they record notes about quality, productivity, and any problems they observe. When an inspector approaches your workstation, your heart races. You stand at attention, eyes downcast, waiting for their judgment. Most inspections pass without incident. The inspector glances at your work, makes a notation on their tablet, and moves on. But sometimes, an inspector will pause. They'll lean in close, examining a detail. They might run their finger along a cheekbone or peer closely at the shape of an ear. In these moments, time seems to stop. Your entire future hangs on this official's assessment of your work. A nod of approval means you're safe, at least for now. A frown or a critical comment means punishment, reduced rations, or worse. The psychological toll of this constant surveillance is immense. You find yourself second-guessing every decision, every artistic choice. Should you make this warrior's expression slightly more stern? Is this eyebrow positioned correctly? Does this ear look too distinctive, too memorable? The irony is that you're supposed to be creating unique individuals, but you're terrified of making anything too unique, anything that might draw unwanted attention. At midday, there's a brief break for another meal. This one is slightly more substantial, perhaps some vegetables with your rice, maybe even a small piece of dried fish if you've met your quotas. But the break is short, barely long enough to eat and relieve yourself. There's a constant awareness of time slipping away, of quotas that must be met before nightfall. The afternoon work is the hardest because your body is already exhausted from the morning's labor. Your hands cramp, your back screams in protest, your eyes strain to see fine details in the dim light. But the work must continue. You've learned to enter a kind of trance state, where your hands move almost automatically while your mind drifts to memories of your life before this. Of family you may never see again, of a future you know will never come. As evening approaches, the quality of light in the workshop changes. Oil lamps are lit, casting dancing shadows that make the clay faces seem almost alive. This is when mistakes are most likely to happen, when tired eyes misread dimensions or exhausted hands slip. You've learned to work more slowly in these hours, sacrificing speed for accuracy. Because a mistake made now could mean starting over tomorrow, falling behind on your quota, facing punishment. When the final bell sounds, signaling the end of the workday, there's no sense of relief, only exhaustion. You carefully cover your work in progress with damp cloths to keep the clay from drying out overnight. You clean your tools, knowing that arriving tomorrow to find them dirty would result in punishment. You make mental notes of what needs to be done tomorrow, which pieces are ready for the next stage, which need more work. The evening meal is the largest of the day, but by this time you're often too tired to properly appreciate it. You eat mechanically, refueling your body for another day of labor. Around you, other workers do the same, most eating in silence. Conversation is limited because you're all too exhausted for socializing, and because everyone knows that anything said might be overheard and reported. As you finally collapse onto your sleeping mat, your last thoughts before unconsciousness takes you are of tomorrow. Another day of shaping clay, another day of survival, another day closer to either completion of this impossible project or your own inevitable death. The clay faces you create stare at nothing with their empty eyes, waiting to be transformed from mere sculptures into an army that will stand guard over an emperor's tomb for thousands of years. And you, the creator of these faces, are just as much a prisoner as they are, trapped in a system where human life is valued less than the clay it shapes. The rise and paranoia of Qin Shi Huang, the emperor who conquered death. To understand the true terror behind the Terracotta Army, we must first understand the man who ordered its creation. Qin Shi Huang wasn't just any ruler. He was a man so consumed by power and paranoia that he believed he could conquer death itself. His story is one of unprecedented ambition, brilliant strategy, and a descent into a madness that would reshape an entire civilization. Born as Ying Zheng in 259 BCE, the future first emperor of China entered the world during one of the most chaotic periods in Chinese history. The Warring States period had torn the land apart for over 2 centuries, with 7 major kingdoms locked in constant, brutal conflict. His father, King Juanjiang of Qin, ruled one of these warring states, but died when Zheng was only 13 years old. This left a teenage boy to inherit a throne in a world where weakness meant death, and where assassination was a common political tool. The young king's childhood was marked by betrayal and violence. His own mother, Queen Dowager Xiao, became embroiled in political scandals that threatened to destroy the royal family. When Zheng was just 9 years old, his mother began an affair with a man named Lao Ai, who eventually attempted to stage a coup. The discovery of this plot led to Lao Ai's execution and the exile of Zheng's own mother. For a child who would grow up to trust no one, these early experiences of betrayal within his own family would prove formative. But it was another betrayal that would truly shape the future emperor's worldview. His chancellor, Lu Buwei, the man who had essentially raised him and guided his early reign, was discovered to be plotting against him. Lu Buwei had been instrumental in placing Zheng on the throne, but as the young king grew in power and confidence, their relationship deteriorated. When evidence emerged that Lu Buwei was involved in various conspiracies, Zheng forced him to commit suicide. The lesson was clear. Everyone, even those closest to you, could become enemies. These experiences didn't break the young king. They forged him into something unprecedented. By the age of 25, Zheng had consolidated power within his own state and set his sights on something no ruler had ever achieved: the complete unification of China under a single emperor. What followed was a military campaign of breathtaking scope and ruthlessness. The conquest began with the state of Han in 230 BCE. Zheng's armies, equipped with superior iron weapons and organized with military precision that surpassed their enemies, swept through Han territory with devastating efficiency. The king of Han surrendered without a major battle, perhaps hoping for mercy. He received none. Zheng had learned that showing mercy to defeated enemies only created future problems. The royal family of Han was executed, their nobles scattered or killed, and their territory absorbed into the expanding Qin Empire. The state of Zhao fell next. In 228 BCE, this conquest was particularly brutal because Zhao had been Zheng's mother's homeland, and he harbored deep resentment toward the people who had shaped her treacherous character. The siege of Han and Zhao's capital lasted months. When the city finally fell, Zheng ordered the execution of all the royal family members and buried 400,000 soldiers alive. This wasn't just military strategy. It was a message to the remaining independent states about the price of resistance. With each conquest, Zheng's methods became more sophisticated and more terrifying. He didn't just defeat armies, he systematically destroyed the cultural and political structures that had defined each state. Local customs were banned, regional languages were suppressed, and ancient noble families were eliminated entirely. He was creating not just a unified territory, but a unified people, molded in his own image and subject to his absolute will. The state of Wei surrendered in 225 BCE after witnessing the fate of Han and Zhao. The state of Chu, despite being the largest and most powerful of the remaining independent kingdoms, fell in 223 BCE after a campaign that saw entire cities reduced to rubble. The state of Yan was conquered in 222 BCE, and finally, the state of Qi surrendered without a fight in 221 BCE, bringing the warring states period to an end after more than 2 centuries of conflict. But victory in war was only the beginning of Zheng's transformation. In 221 BCE, at the age of 38, he declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. The title itself was revolutionary. Previous rulers had been called kings, but Zheng created a new word, Huang, which combined the concepts of divine ruler and supreme earthly power. He wasn't just claiming to rule China, he was claiming to be a god on earth. The early years of his reign were marked by extraordinary achievements. He standardized currency, weights, and measures across the empire. He created a unified writing system that replaced the dozens of regional scripts that had made communication between states difficult. He built roads and canals that connected distant regions for the first time in history. He began construction of what would become the Great Wall, connecting and extending existing fortifications into a barrier that would protect China from northern invasions. But these achievements came at a staggering human cost. The emperor's construction projects required millions of workers, many of whom were conscripted peasants or prisoners of war. The mortality rate on these projects was catastrophic. Historians estimate that over 1 million people died building the Great Wall alone. The emperor's response to these deaths was coldly pragmatic. There were always more workers available, and the empire's needs took precedence over individual lives. As the emperor aged, his paranoia deepened and took on increasingly bizarre forms. He became obsessed with the idea that his enemies were plotting against him, not just in the present, but from beyond the grave. He began to believe that the spirits of the rulers he had defeated, the nobles he had executed, and the soldiers he had killed were gathering in the afterlife to wage war against him when he died. This belief would eventually drive him to commission the Terracotta Army, but it also led to increasingly erratic behavior during his lifetime. The emperor's fear of death became all-consuming. He consulted with alchemists and magicians, seeking elixirs of immortality. He sent expeditions to mythical islands where immortals were said to live. He built multiple palaces so that potential assassins would never know where he was sleeping. He traveled constantly, never staying in one place long enough for enemies to plan an attack. He even changed his route and schedule randomly, sometimes deciding at the last moment to visit a different city or to turn back entirely. His paranoia extended to everyone around him. He installed elaborate spy networks to monitor his own officials. He created a system where multiple people were responsible for the same tasks, so that if one person betrayed him, others would report it. He regularly executed entire families for the crimes of single individuals, believing that loyalty was inherited and that traitors' relatives would inevitably seek revenge. The emperor's obsession with control led him to one of the most infamous acts in Chinese history, the burning of the books. In 213 BCE, he ordered the destruction of all literature except for technical manuals and official histories. His reasoning was that knowledge of the past gave people ideas about alternative ways of organizing society. By controlling information, he could control thoughts. Scholars who protested were buried alive. Libraries that had preserved centuries of Chinese thought and culture were reduced to ash. But even as he eliminated external threats and controlled information, the emperor's greatest enemy was time itself. Despite all his efforts to achieve immortality, he continued to age. His hair turned grey, his body weakened, and his mind became increasingly unstable. He began to have vivid dreams about being attacked by the spirits of his victims. He claimed to see the ghosts of defeated kings in his palaces. He became convinced that his death would trigger a supernatural war in the afterlife. It was during this period of escalating paranoia that the emperor conceived his most ambitious project, a tomb complex that would serve as his headquarters in the afterlife. This wouldn't just be a burial site. It would be a fully functional palace and military base from which he could continue to rule even after death. The centerpiece of this complex would be an army of terracotta soldiers, each one individually crafted and equipped with real weapons, ready to defend their emperor against any spiritual enemies. The emperor's instructions for his tomb were specific and terrifying. The burial chamber was to be filled with mercury, which would flow like rivers and seas, allowing him to travel through his underground kingdom. The ceiling was to be decorated with pearls and gems, arranged like constellations, creating a night sky that would never change. Mechanical crossbows were to be installed to kill anyone who might try to enter the tomb. And surrounding it all, the Terracotta Army would stand guard, ready to march against any threat. But the emperor's paranoia didn't stop with planning his tomb. He became convinced that if the workers who built it were allowed to live, they would eventually reveal its secrets to his enemies. He began to speak of the need for eternal silence among those who knew too much about his preparations for the afterlife. This wasn't just about protecting treasures from tomb robbers. It was about maintaining his power even after death. In 210 BCE, while traveling on one of his paranoid inspection tours, the emperor suddenly fell ill. Some historians believe he may have been poisoned by the mercury-based elixirs he had been consuming in his quest for immortality. Others think he may have suffered a stroke brought on by years of stress and paranoia. But as he lay dying, his greatest fear wasn't death itself. It was the possibility that his enemies would discover his weakness and use it against him. The emperor died far from his capital, and his death was kept secret for months while his body was transported back to the capital. His tomb complex, including the Terracotta Army, was still under construction. The work would continue for years after his death, but it would never be completed according to his original vision. The man who had conquered all of China, who had unified a civilization, who had tried to control even death itself, was finally defeated by the one enemy he couldn't execute, exile, or intimidate: time. The story of Qin Shi Huang reveals the true terror behind the Terracotta Army. These weren't just statues commissioned by a powerful ruler. They were the product of a man so consumed by paranoia and fear that he believed he needed an army to protect him from the very people he had killed. Every warrior, every horse, every weapon was created not just as art, but as a tool in a supernatural war that existed only in the emperor's increasingly unstable mind. Understanding this context makes the Terracotta Army more than just an archaeological marvel. It becomes a monument to the human cost of absolute power, a testament to what happens when a brilliant leader is consumed by fear and paranoia. The thousands of clay soldiers standing in their underground formations aren't just impressive craftsmanship. They're the physical manifestation of one man's terror of death and his desperate attempt to extend his control beyond the grave. The emperor who commissioned them believed he would need them to fight battles in the afterlife. He never imagined that the real battle would be fought by historians and archaeologists, working to understand the human story behind these silent clay warriors. He never imagined that his greatest enemies wouldn't be the spirits of defeated kings, but time and truth, slowly revealing the cost of his ambition to a world that would judge him not as a god, but as a man whose brilliance was matched only by his capacity for terror. The emperor's transformation from brilliant strategist to paranoid tyrant didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, marked by specific incidents that deepened his mistrust and amplified his fears. One of the most significant occurred in 227 BCE, when an assassin named Qin Shi nearly succeeded in killing him. The assassination attempt happened during what should have been a diplomatic meeting, when a supposed envoy from the state of Yan presented the emperor with gifts, including a map and the head of a wanted fugitive. As the emperor unrolled the map, Qin Shi suddenly grabbed a poisoned dagger that had been hidden inside and lunged at him. The attack caught everyone by surprise. The emperor's guards were positioned too far away to intervene immediately, as protocol required them to remain at a distance during formal audiences. For several terrifying moments, the emperor found himself alone with an assassin, desperately dodging attacks while trying to draw his own sword, which was so long that he couldn't unsheath it while running. The emperor survived only because one of his physicians, who happened to be nearby, threw his medicine bag at the assassin, momentarily distracting him. This gave the emperor time to finally draw his sword and strike back. Severely wounding Qin Shi, guards rushed in and finished the assassination, but the damage to the emperor's psyche was permanent. He had come within inches of death, and the realization that even in his own palace, surrounded by guards and officials, he was vulnerable, fundamentally changed him. After the assassination attempt, the emperor's security measures became increasingly elaborate and bizarre. He ordered the construction of multiple identical bedchambers in each of his palaces, sleeping in a different one each night, according to a random pattern that only he knew. He required all visitors, even his closest advisors, to undergo extensive searches before entering his presence. He banned all weapons within his palaces, including ceremonial swords carried by guards, replacing them with wooden staffs. But perhaps most tellingly, he became obsessed with the idea that his enemies were not just physical threats, but spiritual ones. He began to consult with shamans and mystics who told him that the spirits of those he had killed were gathering strength in the afterlife, preparing to attack him when he died. These spiritual advisors played on his fears, suggesting that unless he took extraordinary measures to protect himself after death, he would be overwhelmed by vengeful ghosts the moment his soul left his body. This spiritual paranoia drove him to commission the Terracotta Army, but it also led to other, even stranger projects. He ordered the construction of elaborate spirit walls around his palaces, designed to confuse and trap malevolent ghosts. He had feng shui masters reconfigure entire cities to redirect negative spiritual energy away from his residences. He sponsored expeditions to find magical artifacts that were said to provide protection against supernatural attacks. The emperor's quest for immortality became increasingly desperate as he aged. In 219 BCE, he sent an expedition of thousands of young men and women to search for the legendary Pengli mountain, where immortals were said to live. The expedition was led by a court magician named Su Fu, who promised to return with the elixir of immortality. The expedition never returned, and some historians believe they actually sailed to Japan and established settlements there, rather than face the emperor's wrath for failing to find immortality. Undeterred by this failure, the emperor continued to seek immortality through increasingly dangerous means. He consumed mercury-based elixirs daily, believing that mercury's liquid nature and its ability to remain pure made it a key ingredient for eternal life. His alchemists prepared elaborate concoctions that combined mercury with jade powder, gold dust, and rare herbs. The emperor insisted on taking these elixirs, despite experiencing obvious symptoms of mercury poisoning, including tremors, memory loss, and personality changes. The emperor's paranoia extended to his own family. He had numerous sons from his many wives and concubines, but he trusted none of them. He kept his sons under constant surveillance and rarely allowed them access to military forces or administrative power. He frequently changed his designated heir, sometimes imprisoning sons who he suspected of being too ambitious. This created an atmosphere of intense rivalry among his offspring, with each son trying to prove their loyalty while simultaneously preparing for the possibility of seizing power. His relationship with his wives and concubines was equally complex and disturbing. The emperor viewed these women as possessions rather than people, and he treated them accordingly. They were kept in elaborate harems where they competed for his attention, knowing that bearing him a son could elevate their status but also make them targets for the jealousy of other concubines. The emperor rotated through his concubines on a schedule designed to prevent any one woman from gaining too much influence over him. As death approached, the emperor's grip on reality became increasingly tenuous. He began to have vivid hallucinations, seeing dragons in the clouds and hearing voices that he claimed were messages from the gods. His courtiers learned to agree with whatever he said, no matter how bizarre, because disagreeing with the emperor's visions was seen as questioning his divine nature. The line between reality and delusion blurred, and the court became a place where madness was indulged and even celebrated as evidence of the emperor's supernatural connection. The emperor's building projects became more granatic and more impracticable. In addition to the Terracotta Army and his tomb complex, he ordered the construction of hundreds of palaces, some of which were used only once or never at all. He had artificial mountains built and rivers rerouted according to his whims. He demanded that entire forests be cleared and replanted in different locations because he decided he didn't like their current positions. The cost in human lives and resources was staggering, but anyone who suggested these projects were excessive risked execution. His treatment of intellectuals and scholars during this period reveals the extent of his paranoia and his desire for absolute control over all aspects of society. The book burning of 213 BCE wasn't just about destroying old texts. It was about eliminating any source of authority other than the emperor himself. He ordered that all books, except those dealing with medicine, agriculture, and divination, be surrendered and burned. Scholars who protested were rounded up, and according to historical accounts, 460 of them were buried alive as an example to others. But the emperor's paranoia led him to an interesting contradiction. While he destroyed books that might challenge his authority, he also commissioned massive writing projects to document his own reign and ensure his legacy. Teams of scribes worked continuously to record his edicts, his achievements, and his wisdom. These official histories were carefully edicted to present the emperor as a benevolent ruler whose harsh measures were necessary for the good of the empire. The emperor understood that controlling the narrative of history was as important as controlling physical territory. In his final years, the emperor's physical appearance reflected his inner turmoil. The mercury poisoning had taken its toll, leaving his skin with a greyish pallor and his hands with a persistent tremor. He had lost weight despite eating elaborate meals, and his hair had turned white prematurely, but he insisted on maintaining appearances, using cosmetics and wearing elaborate robes that disguised his deteriorating condition. He refused to acknowledge that he was aging, let alone dying, and anyone who mentioned his declining health was severely punished. The journey on which he died was typical of his paranoid lifestyle. He was traveling to different parts of his empire ostensibly to inspect the borders and ensure local officials were loyal. But in reality, these journeys were motivated by his belief that staying in motion made him harder to assassinate or curse. He traveled with an enormous entourage, including hundreds of guards, dozens of officials, and wagons full of supplies and treasures. The procession moved slowly, stopping frequently as the emperor's health deteriorated. When death finally came, it found the emperor in a sealed carriage, surrounded by a handful of his closest advisors. According to historical accounts, he died suddenly, possibly from a stroke or heart attack brought on by his mercury consumption and the stress of his lifestyle. But his death was kept secret for months, with his advisors continuing to present food to his carriage and pretending to receive orders from him. They did this partly to maintain stability in the empire, but also because they feared what would happen when news of his death became public. The emperor's body was transported back to the capital in his sealed carriage, accompanied by carts of rotting fish to mask the smell of decomposition. This macabre procession traveled for weeks, with officials pretending that the emperor was still alive and simply preferred to remain in seclusion. When the body finally reached the capital, the truth could no longer be hidden, and the succession crisis that the emperor had feared began immediately. The legacy of Qin Shi Huang is one of contradictions. He unified China and created administrative systems that would endure for 2,000 years. He standardized writing, currency, and measurements, making it possible for a vast empire to function efficiently. He built roads and walls that protected and connected his realm. But he did all of this through methods that were breathtakingly cruel, sacrificing millions of lives to achieve his vision of perfect order and control. The Terracotta Army stands as the ultimate symbol of these contradictions. It represents incredible artistic achievement and engineering skill, but it was created through forced labor and at the cost of countless lives. It demonstrates the emperor's brilliant strategic thinking, but also his descent into paranoid madness. It showcases the heights of human civilization, but also the depths of human cruelty. Understanding the emperor's life helps us understand why the Terracotta Army exists and what it truly represents. Not just artistic triumph, but a monument to the terrible price of absolute power and the eternal human fear of death. The mysteries that still haunt the Terracotta Army. In March 1974, a group of farmers digging a well in Shan, China, made a discovery that would change archaeology forever. But what they found wasn't just ancient pottery or a few old coins. They had stumbled upon what experts now believe is only a small fraction of the most elaborate tomb complex ever created. The Terracotta Army, as it came to be known, has revealed many secrets over the past 50 years. But the mysteries that remain unsolved are far more terrifying than anything archaeologists have yet uncovered. The first mystery begins with the discovery itself. Yong Jafar, the farmer who first spotted the clay fragments in his well, described finding pieces that looked like broken pottery, but with an unusual reddish color and strange textures. When he pulled larger fragments from the earth, he realized he was looking at pieces of human-like figures. What he couldn't have known was that he had found the outer edge of a military formation that stretched for acres underground, a discovery that would eventually reveal over 8,000 individual warriors, 130 chariots, and 670 horses. But here's what makes this discovery truly mysterious. The farmers were digging in what was supposed to be empty farmland. There were no historical records indicating that anything significant was buried in this location. The tomb complex of Qin Shi Huang was known to be somewhere in the area, but historical texts suggested it was several miles away. How had such a massive undertaking remained completely hidden for over 2 millennia? And if this was just the outer perimeter of the emperor's tomb complex, what else might be buried in the surrounding area? The scale of what has been uncovered defies comprehension. Pit 1, the largest excavation, contains over 6,000 warriors arranged in military formation. Pit 2 contains cavalry units, archers, and war chariots. Pit 3 appears to be a command center with high-ranking officers. But ground-penetrating radar has revealed that there are likely dozens more pits, most of which remain unexcavated. The Chinese government has made the decision to leave many of these sites untouched, partly due to the complexity of preservation, but also because they're not entirely sure what they might find. One of the most unsettling discoveries came when archaeologists began studying the faces of the warriors. Each face is unique, carved with individual features, expressions, and even different facial hairstyles. Initially, this was celebrated as evidence of the incredible craftsmanship of ancient Chinese artisans. But as experts examined more warriors, they began to notice something disturbing. Many of the faces appeared to be based on real people. The level of detail, the specific ethnic features, the individual characteristics, all suggested that these weren't generic soldier faces, but portraits of actual individuals. This realization led to a chilling possibility. What if the Terracotta Army wasn't just inspired by real soldiers, but was actually modeled on Qin Shi Huang's actual army? Historical records mention that the emperor's military forces were massive, potentially numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They also mention that after the emperor's death, many of his soldiers simply disappeared from historical records. Could it be that the faces we see on the terracotta warriors are the last remaining portraits of men who were sacrificed to serve their emperor in death as they had in life? The weapons carried by the terracotta warriors present another mystery that has baffled experts. These aren't ceremonial or decorative weapons. They're fully functional, battle-ready arms. The bronze swords are still sharp enough to cut paper. The spearheads are perfectly balanced. The crossbow bolts are designed for maximum penetration. But here's what's truly remarkable. Many of these weapons show signs of having been used in actual combat. There are nicks in sword blades, where patterns on spear shafts, and damage consistent with battlefield use. This discovery raises disturbing questions about the timeline of the tomb's construction. The emperor died in 210 BCE, and historical records suggest that work on his tomb continued for at least 2 more years. But if the weapons show signs of combat use, when did that combat occur? Were these weapons taken from battlefields and placed with the warriors? Or is it possible that the tomb complex was the site of actual fighting, perhaps involving the workers who built it? The mystery deepens when we consider the chemical composition of the clay used to create the warriors. Modern analysis has revealed that the clay contains unusual mineral compositions that don't match the local soil. The clay appears to have come from multiple locations, some of which are hundreds of miles away. Why would the emperor's craftsmen go to such lengths to acquire specific types of clay? And why would they mix clays from different regions? Some experts believe the answer lies in ancient Chinese beliefs about the spiritual properties of different types of earth. Certain clays were thought to have protective qualities, while others were believed to enhance the spiritual power of objects created from them. If this is true, then the Terracotta Army wasn't just created as a physical representation of soldiers, but as a spiritual army with supernatural powers. The emperor may have believed that by using sacred clays from across his empire, he was creating warriors that would be more effective in the afterlife than living soldiers would be in the physical world. But the most terrifying mystery of all concerns what archaeologists haven't found. Despite decades of excavation, no human remains have been discovered among the terracotta warriors. This might seem normal at first. After all, these are clay soldiers, not real people. But historical records from the period mention that the emperor's tomb complex was designed to house not just his terracotta army, but also his actual servants, concubines, and soldiers who would serve him in the afterlife. Ancient Chinese texts describe the practice of human sacrifice at imperial funerals, particularly for rulers who believed they needed servants in the afterlife. The records specifically mention that Qin Shi Huang ordered hundreds of his childless concubines to be buried with him, along with the craftsmen who worked on his tomb to ensure secrecy. If these accounts are accurate, then somewhere within the tomb complex, there should be chambers filled with human remains. The fact that these chambers haven't been found suggests either that they're deeper underground than anyone has excavated, or that they're in locations that haven't been explored yet. The absence of human remains becomes even more mysterious when we consider the layout of the Terracotta Army. The warriors are arranged in precise military formations, but there are gaps in the formations, spaces that seem designed to accommodate additional figures. Some archaeologists believe these gaps were intended for human sacrifices, real soldiers who would be buried among the terracotta warriors to serve as officers or specialists. If this theory is correct, then the missing human remains might not be in separate chambers, but integrated throughout the army itself. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed what appears to be a vast underground palace beneath the main tomb mound. This palace is described in historical texts as containing rivers of mercury, mechanical crossbows, and chambers filled with treasures. But the radar images show something that doesn't match the historical descriptions. Areas that appear to be filled with organic material, possibly preserved human remains. The Chinese government has been reluctant to excavate these areas, partly due to the technical challenges involved, but also because they may not be prepared for what they might find. The mercury mentioned in historical accounts presents its own mystery. Ancient texts describe the emperor's burial chamber as containing flowing rivers of mercury, designed to represent the rivers and seas of China. When archaeologists tested the soil above the unopened burial chamber, they found mercury levels that are hundreds of times higher than normal background levels. This confirms that there is indeed a large quantity of mercury somewhere beneath the tomb mound, but it also raises questions about why the emperor would want to be buried in such a toxic environment. Some experts believe the mercury wasn't just decorative, but was intended to preserve the emperor's body for eternity. Mercury was thought to have magical properties in ancient China, and the emperor may have believed that surrounding himself with mercury would prevent his body from decaying. But if this is true, then the emperor's remains might be perfectly preserved, waiting to be discovered in a chamber filled with one of the most toxic substances known to humanity. The mystery deepens when we consider the timing of the tomb's construction. Historical records suggest that work on the tomb began almost immediately after. Qin Shi Huang became emperor in 221 BCE and continued until at least 208 BCE, 2 years after his death. But recent archaeological evidence suggests that some parts of the complex may have been built much earlier, possibly even before the emperor unified China. This raises the possibility that the tomb complex wasn't just a burial site, but was intended to serve as a functional military base that could be used during the emperor's lifetime. If this theory is correct, then the Terracotta Army might not have been created solely for the afterlife, but as part of a real military installation. The warriors might have been designed to intimidate living enemies as well as spiritual ones. The weapons might have been kept sharp, not for supernatural battles, but for potential real-world conflicts. And the human remains that haven't been found might not be sacrificial victims, but soldiers who died defending the installation. Recent discoveries have added new layers to these mysteries. In 2022, archaeologists announced the discovery of what appears to be a vast underground workshop complex adjacent to the known warrior pits. This workshop contains evidence of metalworking, pottery making, and what looks like weapon manufacturing on an industrial scale. But the workshop also contains something unexpected, evidence of what appears to be medical facilities, including what looks like surgical instruments and areas that may have been used for treating wounded soldiers. The presence of medical facilities in a tomb complex raises disturbing questions. Were these facilities used to treat workers who were injured during construction, or were they used for more sinister purposes? Perhaps to prepare human sacrifices, or to conduct the kind of medical procedures that would be necessary if living people were being prepared for burial. The surgical instruments found in the workshop are remarkably advanced for their time, suggesting that whoever used them had extensive knowledge of human anatomy. Perhaps the most unsettling mystery involves the Emperor's actual burial chamber, which remains unopened. Advanced imaging techniques have revealed that the chamber contains not just the Emperor's sarcophagus, but what appears to be a complex system of rooms and corridors. Some of these rooms appear to contain large numbers of objects, possibly treasures or additional terracotta figures. But other rooms appear to contain organic materials that could be preserved human remains. The decision to leave the Emperor's burial chamber unopened isn't just about preserving archaeological integrity, it's about safety. The mercury levels are so high that opening the chamber could release toxic vapors that would be lethal to anyone nearby. But it's also about the possibility that opening the chamber might reveal evidence of atrocities so horrific that they would fundamentally change our understanding of ancient Chinese civilization. The Terracotta Army represents one of humanity's greatest archaeological discoveries, but it also represents one of our greatest mysteries. Every answer that archaeologists have found has led to more questions. Every revealed secret has hinted at deeper, more terrifying secrets that remain hidden. And every clay warrior that has been uncovered has raised the possibility that the true horror of Qin Shi Huang's tomb complex isn't what we've found, but what we haven't found yet. As we continue to study this incredible discovery, we're forced to confront the possibility that the Terracotta Army isn't just a monument to imperial power, but a crime scene on a scale that defies comprehension. The silent clay soldiers standing in their eternal formations may be the only witnesses to atrocities that occurred over 2 millennia ago. And they're keeping their secrets as effectively in death as they were commanded to in life. The paint that once covered the terracotta warriors presents one of archaeology's most frustrating mysteries and heartbreaking losses. When the warriors were first created, they weren't the grey clay figures we see in museums today. They were vibrantly painted in brilliant colours: reds, greens, blues, purples, and pinks, creating a visual spectacle that must have been absolutely stunning. Ancient texts describe the Emperor's underground army as being so lifelike that they seemed ready to march at any moment. And this effect was achieved partly through the incredibly detailed and realistic paintwork. But here's where the tragedy enters the story. When archaeologists first began excavating the warriors in the 1970s, they watched helplessly as the paint began to flake off almost immediately upon exposure to air. Within minutes of being uncovered, paint that had survived for over 2,000 years in the sealed, climate-controlled environment of the underground chambers began to dry, crack, and fall away. The workers at the excavation site described it as watching history die before their eyes, powerless to stop the process. This discovery led to a dramatic decision that still affects the excavation today. Chinese authorities realized that they didn't yet have the technology to preserve the paint on the warriors. Rather than continue excavating and lose more of this precious evidence of ancient artistry, they made the controversial choice to stop large-scale excavation until preservation methods could be developed. This means that thousands of warriors remain buried, still wearing their original paint, waiting for the day when they can be safely brought to the surface. The few warriors that were excavated before this decision was made have provided tantalizing glimpses of what the full army must have looked like. Microscopic analysis of paint fragments has revealed that the ancient Chinese artisans used a sophisticated layering technique, applying a base coat of lacquer before adding mineral-based pigments. The colors weren't randomly applied either. Different ranks of soldiers wore different colored uniforms, and the paint schemes appear to have followed actual military regulations from the Qin dynasty. But the paint reveals something even more intriguing and disturbing. Chemical analysis has shown that some of the pigments used were extremely rare and expensive, requiring trade networks that stretched across Asia. The purple paint, for instance, was made from a compound called Chinese purple, which required temperatures and chemical processes that were thought to be beyond the capabilities of ancient civilizations. The discovery of this pigment has forced scientists to completely revise their understanding of ancient Chinese chemistry and technology. Even more mysteriously, some of the paint contains organic compounds that suggest the use of blood as a binding agent. While this practice wasn't uncommon in ancient art, the quantities involved and the specific chemical signatures have led some researchers to propose a disturbing theory. Could the paint have been mixed with the blood of the very workers who created the warriors? Was this some kind of ritual binding, meant to tie the spirits of the craftsmen to their creations, ensuring they would serve the emperor in death as they had in life? The weapons found with the Terracotta Army continued to astound researchers with their sophistication and the mysteries they present. The bronze swords, for instance, were coated with a thin layer of chromium oxide, a preservation technique that wasn't rediscovered in the West until the 1930s, over 2,000 years later. This coating kept the swords sharp and rust-free for millennia. But how did ancient Chinese metallurgists develop this technology? And why was it apparently lost after the fall of the Qin dynasty, only to be rediscovered in modern times? The crossbow triggers found with the warriors are precision-engineered bronze mechanisms that are interchangeable between different weapons. This suggests a level of standardization and mass production that historians didn't think existed in the ancient world. Some of these triggers still function perfectly after more than 2 millennia underground, clicking smoothly into position with the precision of modern machinery. The engineering tolerances involved in creating these mechanisms are so tight that they challenge our assumptions about ancient manufacturing capabilities. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the weapons is their sheer quantity and quality. These aren't ceremonial weapons or cheap reproductions made specifically for burial. They're real, battle-ready arms that could kill as effectively today as they could 2,000 years ago. Why would the emperor waste such valuable military equipment by burying it with clay soldiers? Unless, of course, he truly believed these warriors would need functional weapons in the afterlife. Or unless there were so many weapons being produced that even thousands of them represented a negligible loss to the imperial armory. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of what appears to be a training ground or parade ground within the tomb complex. This area shows signs of wear consistent with repeated foot traffic, as if formations of soldiers had marched across it many times. But this raises a perplexing question. Why would there be a training ground in a tomb complex? Was this area used to drill living soldiers before the tomb was sealed? Or, more disturbingly, could this be evidence that the emperor intended his terracotta warriors to somehow be animated, requiring them to practice formations before his death? The drainage system discovered throughout the tomb complex is another engineering marvel that raises more questions than it answers. The underground chambers are equipped with sophisticated drainage channels that have kept them remarkably dry for over 2 millennia, preventing the kind of water damage that has destroyed so many other archaeological sites. But the drainage system is far more elaborate than necessary for simple water management. Some channels appear to be designed to direct water in specific patterns, creating what some researchers believe might have been decorative water features, or even functional moats within the underground complex. More mysteriously, some of these drainage channels contain traces of mercury, supporting the ancient texts that describe rivers of mercury flowing through the emperor's tomb. But the engineering required to create channels that could safely contain liquid mercury without it seeping into the surrounding earth is extraordinarily complex. How did ancient engineers solve this problem? And if they succeeded in creating mercury rivers, what was their purpose beyond mere decoration? Mercury was associated with immortality in ancient Chinese alchemy. Could these mercury rivers have been intended as some kind of life-giving system for the emperor's preserved body? The acoustic properties of the underground chambers have revealed yet another layer of mystery. When archaeologists made recordings in the excavated pits, they discovered that the spaces have unusual acoustic characteristics. Sounds echo in strange ways, and certain frequencies are amplified while others are dampened. Some researchers believe this might have been intentional, that the chambers were designed to produce specific acoustic effects. Could there have been ceremonies performed in these spaces before they were sealed? Were the acoustics meant to amplify the sounds of marching feet, creating the illusion of an active army even in the silence of a sealed tomb? The discovery of what appears to be an astronomical observatory within the tomb complex has added another dimension to our understanding of the emperor's grand design. This structure contains bronze instruments that seem to be designed for tracking celestial movements. The ceiling of one chamber is decorated with what appears to be a star map, showing constellations with remarkable accuracy. But this raises questions about the emperor's intentions. Was he planning to continue his study of the heavens from beyond the grave? Or did he believe that understanding celestial patterns was necessary for navigating the afterlife? Perhaps one of the most chilling discoveries came from analysis of the soil in and around the tomb complex. Researchers have found unusually high concentrations of various chemicals, including compounds associated with human decomposition. But these concentrations are far higher than would be expected from the natural decay of a single body, even an emperor's. This has led to speculation that there may be mass burial sites within the complex, places where hundreds or even thousands of people were interred, either as sacrifices or as a way of silencing witnesses to the tomb's secrets. Recent advances in ground-penetrating radar have revealed what appear to be vast, unexplored sections of the tomb complex. These areas show geometric patterns that suggest carefully planned structures, possibly entire palace complexes built underground. Some of these structures appear to be multiple stories deep, creating a three-dimensional underground city that dwarfs anything that has been excavated so far. The question that haunts archaeologists is simple. What could possibly be in these unexplored areas that would require such massive construction? And why has the Chinese government been so reluctant to excavate them? The technology required to excavate and preserve these finds continues to be a limiting factor. The terracotta warriors themselves are incredibly fragile once removed from their underground environment. Many have suffered damage during excavation and conservation, despite the best efforts of archaeologists. This fragility, combined with the massive scale of the site, means that it could take hundreds of years to fully excavate and study the tomb complex, assuming excavation even continues at current rates. But perhaps the greatest mystery is the one that can never be fully answered. What did the emperor truly believe he was creating? Did he genuinely think his terracotta army would come to life in the afterlife? Was he attempting to create a functional military base that could operate in the spiritual realm? Or was the entire project an elaborate statement of power, meant to awe and terrify anyone who might one day discover it? The emperor took his true intentions to the grave, and the silent warriors he left behind guard those secrets as faithfully in death as they would have guarded their emperor in life if he had succeeded in his quest for immortality. Life and death in the imperial court. The elite who enabled the emperor's vision, while thousands of workers toiled in the clay pits and workshops, creating the Terracotta Army under conditions of unimaginable hardship. There was another world existing in parallel, a world of luxury, privilege, and political intrigue that made the emperor's grand vision possible. The imperial court of Qin Shi Huang was a place where wealth and power coexisted with constant fear, where the emperor's closest advisors lived in splendor, while knowing that a single mistake could mean death for themselves and their entire families. To understand the full scope of the terror behind the Terracotta Army, we must examine the lives of those who planned it, financed it, and oversaw its construction. These were not just bureaucrats following orders, but individuals who actively participated in creating one of history's most elaborate monuments to paranoia and control. Their stories reveal how a civilization can be transformed when absolute power is combined with unlimited resources and the complete absence of moral restraint. At the apex of this world stood Li Si, the emperor's chief advisor and the man many historians consider the true architect of imperial China. Li Si was a brilliant political theorist who had studied under the philosopher Zhuangzi, and he brought to the emperor's court a sophisticated understanding of how to use law, punishment, and propaganda to control an entire population. But Li Si was also a man who understood that his own survival depended on satisfying the emperor's increasingly bizarre demands, including the construction of the massive tomb complex. Li Si's daily life was one of extraordinary luxury by the standards of his time. He lived in a palace complex that covered several acres, with courtyards filled with exotic plants and animals brought from across the empire. His meals were prepared by teams of specialized chefs who created dishes that combined ingredients from every corner of China. He wore robes made from the finest silk, decorated with patterns that took master weavers months to complete. He owned libraries containing thousands of books, many of which were destroyed during the emperor's book-burning campaign, but were secretly preserved in his private collection. But this luxury came with a price that extended far beyond money. Li Si's position required him to oversee projects that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. He was responsible for organizing the massive workforce that built the Great Wall, the network of roads that connected the empire, and the tomb complex that would house the Terracotta Army. His administrative genius made these projects possible, but his efficiency also made their human cost almost incomprehensible. The process of organizing labor for the emperor's projects was a marvel of bureaucratic efficiency that would have impressed modern totalitarian regimes. Li Si created a system where local officials were required to provide quotas of workers, much like tax payments. These quotas were based on population, agricultural output, and the political loyalty of each region. Areas that had resisted the emperor's rule were required to provide higher quotas, effectively turning forced labor into a form of collective punishment. The workers themselves were classified into different categories based on their skills and their perceived loyalty to the emperor. Skilled craftsmen, like those who worked on the Terracotta Army, were often taken from their families and relocated to work camps where they could be monitored closely. These craftsmen were provided with better food and living conditions than common laborers. But they were also subject to stricter surveillance and harsher punishments for any perceived disloyalty. Li Si's administrative records, some of which survive today, revealed the chilling bureaucratic language used to describe human lives. Workers were referred to as units of labor, their deaths were recorded as production losses, and their families were classified as dependents requiring management. This dehumanizing language wasn't just administrative convenience. It was a deliberate strategy to make it easier for officials to treat people as expendable resources, rather than as human beings with rights and dignity. The financing of the emperor's projects, including the Terracotta Army, required resources on a scale that had never been attempted before. Zhao Gao, the emperor's chief eunuch and financial advisor, oversaw a tax system that extracted wealth from every corner of the empire. Farmers were required to give up not just a percentage of their crops, but also to provide labor during planting and harvest seasons. Merchants were subjected to heavy taxes on their goods, and skilled craftsmen were forced to work for the state rather than for private clients. But the most lucrative source of funding came from the conquered territories themselves. Xiao Guo organized systematic looting of defeated kingdoms, confiscating not just gold and silver, but also works of art, books, and even skilled craftsmen who were relocated to work on imperial projects. The treasures that filled the emperor's palaces and would eventually be buried in his tomb weren't just displays of wealth. They were the accumulated cultural heritage of an entire civilization, stolen and concentrated in the hands of a single man. The daily routine of court life was structured around the emperor's paranoid schedule. Because Qin Shi Huang feared assassination, he never followed a predictable routine. Meetings were scheduled and cancelled at random, meals were served at irregular times, and even the emperor's sleeping arrangements changed nightly. This meant that the hundreds of officials who served him had to be available at all times, creating a system where the emperor's paranoia disrupted the lives of everyone around him. Court officials lived in a constant state of anxiety, knowing that their survival depended on anticipating the emperor's needs and moods. They developed elaborate systems of spies and informants to monitor each other, creating a web of surveillance that extended throughout the palace. Officials who were perceived as too ambitious were eliminated, but so were those who seemed insufficiently enthusiastic about the emperor's projects. The result was a court where everyone was constantly performing loyalty while secretly plotting against their colleagues. The planning of the Terracotta Army required coordination between dozens of different specialists, each of whom brought their own expertise to the project. Master sculptors worked with military experts to ensure that the armor and weapons were historically accurate. Engineers designed the underground chambers and drainage systems that would preserve the warriors for millennia. Metallurgists developed new techniques for creating bronze weapons that would remain sharp indefinitely. And overseeing all of this was a network of officials who understood that failure would result in their execution. The logistics of creating thousands of individual warrior figures required an industrial approach that was revolutionary for its time. Raw materials had to be transported from across the empire, with different types of clay, metals, and pigments coming from specialized sources. The workshop complex that produced the warriors operated like a factory, with different groups of workers responsible for different aspects of production. Some workers specialized in creating heads, others focused on torsos, and still others were responsible for the intricate details of armor and weapons. But the most disturbing aspect of the court's involvement in the Terracotta Army project was the attention paid to what modern psychologists would recognize as psychological warfare. The emperor and his advisors understood that the army needed to be terrifying not just to supernatural enemies, but to anyone who might discover it. The expressions on the warriors' faces were carefully designed to convey strength, determination, and an almost supernatural alertness. The weapons they carried were not just functional, but were designed to look as menacing as possible. The court's obsession with secrecy extended to elaborate measures to prevent information about the tomb, complex from leaking to potential enemies. Workers were organized into small groups that only knew about their specific tasks. Materials were transported at night, and the routes used were changed regularly to prevent anyone from mapping the full extent of the construction. Officials who oversaw the project were required to swear elaborate oaths of secrecy, and their families were held as hostages to ensure their loyalty. The emperor's concubines represented another tragic aspect of court life during this period. Historical records mention that Qin Shi Huang had hundreds of concubines, women who had been selected for their beauty and brought to the palace from across the empire. These women lived in luxury, but they were also prisoners, confined to the palace complex and forbidden from having contact with their families. They were expected to be available to the emperor at all times, but they also knew that their lives could be ended at his whim. The fate of these concubines became particularly horrific as the emperor's paranoia about death intensified. He began to believe that he would need companions in the afterlife, and historical records suggest that he selected certain concubines to be buried with him. These women were not volunteers. They were victims of a system that treated human lives as imperial property. The process of selecting which concubines would be sacrificed was overseen by court officials who carried out these orders with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to other administrative tasks. The emperor's physicians represented another group of court officials whose lives were shaped by his paranoia. As his obsession with immortality grew, he demanded that his doctors find ways to extend his life indefinitely. Teams of physicians worked on developing elixirs, dietary regimens, and medical procedures that might grant him eternal life. These doctors lived under constant pressure, knowing that failure to produce results could result in their execution, but also knowing that success was impossible. The irony was that the emperor's quest for immortality was slowly killing him. The mercury-based elixirs he consumed were poisoning his body, and the stress of his paranoid lifestyle was destroying his health. His physicians knew this, but they were trapped in a system where telling the emperor the truth would result in their deaths. Instead, they continued to provide him with treatments that they knew were harmful, while secretly hoping that he would die before he could blame them for his deteriorating condition. The final years of the emperor's life saw the court consumed by preparations for his death, even as he continued to insist that he would live forever. Officials were required to make detailed plans for the completion of his tomb complex, while also maintaining the fiction that these preparations were purely theoretical. The result was a surreal situation where the emperor's death was being planned in elaborate detail by people who were forbidden from acknowledging that he was mortal. When the emperor finally died in 210 BCE, the court's carefully constructed facade of loyalty and efficiency collapsed almost immediately. Li Si and Xiao Go, the two most powerful officials in the empire, immediately began plotting against each other for control of the succession. The emperor's son, who was supposed to inherit the throne, was murdered, and a younger, more malleable prince was installed as the new emperor. The empire that had been built on the principle of absolute imperial authority was destroyed by the very people who had been most loyal to that principle. The story of the imperial court that created the Terracotta Army reveals the human cost of absolute power in ways that go beyond simple statistics of death and suffering. It shows how a civilization can be transformed when brilliant people use their talents to serve an insane vision. It demonstrates how luxury and privilege can coexist with moral bankruptcy, and how the pursuit of immortality can become a form of collective suicide. The Terracotta Army stands today as a monument not just to the emperor who commissioned it, but to the thousands of people who made it possible. The skilled craftsmen who shaped each warrior's face, the officials who organized the massive workforce, the engineers who designed the underground chambers, and the courtiers who financed and planned the entire project, all played their part in creating something that was simultaneously magnificent and monstrous. As we conclude our exploration of the terrifying secrets behind the Terracotta Army, we're left with a profound understanding of how human creativity and ambition can be twisted by fear and power into something that serves neither life nor death, but exists as a monument to the capacity for both greatness and horror that lies within human civilization. The clay warriors standing in their eternal formations are more than just archaeological artifacts. They are witnesses to a moment in history when an entire civilization was mobilized to serve one man's terror of mortality. They remind us that behind every great historical achievement lies a human story, and that sometimes the most magnificent creations are built on foundations of unimaginable suffering. The daily rituals of court life revolved around an elaborate system of protocol that governed every interaction, every word, and even every gesture in the emperor's presence. Officials learned to move in specific ways, to bow at precise angles, and to speak in carefully modulated tones that conveyed respect without suggesting obsequiousness, which the emperor viewed as weakness. The protocol manual used by court officials was hundreds of pages long, detailing proper behavior for thousands of different situations. Violations of protocol, even minor ones, could result in severe punishment. The emperor's ministers developed a complex language of indirect communication, speaking in metaphors and allusions that allowed them to convey information without making direct statements that might offend. This linguistic dance became so elaborate that interpreters were sometimes necessary to translate what ministers said into plain language for implementation. But this system also created opportunities for miscommunication and manipulation, as officials could claim their words had been misinterpreted if a policy they suggested turned out poorly. The palace eunuchs formed a shadow government within the imperial court, wielding enormous power despite their technically subservient status. These men, who had been castrated to serve in the imperial household, had access to the emperor at times and in places where other officials could not go. They managed the emperor's private chambers, controlled access to his person, and often served as intermediaries between the emperor and his ministers. The chief eunuch, Zhao Gao, was perhaps the most powerful person in the empire after the emperor himself, and he used this position ruthlessly to advance his own interests. The system of court eunuchs created a parallel hierarchy that often competed with the official governmental structure. Eunuchs accumulated wealth through bribes and corruption, selling access to the emperor and manipulating imperial decisions for personal gain. They formed factions that engaged in elaborate political struggles, with different eunuch groups supporting different ministers or princes in exchange for promises of future rewards. The emperor's paranoia actually empowered the eunuchs because he trusted them more than he trusted intact men, believing that their castration made them incapable of founding competing dynasties. The imperial concubines lived in a world that was simultaneously luxurious and terrifying. These women, numbering in the hundreds, lived in elaborate quarters within the palace complex, each hoping to catch the emperor's attention and bear him a son, which would elevate their status dramatically. But the competition was fierce and often deadly. Concubines who became pregnant were moved to special quarters where they were closely guarded, both for their protection and to ensure that any child born was genuinely the emperor's. The women developed elaborate strategies for attracting the emperor's attention. They studied music, poetry, dance, and the arts of conversation and seduction. They learned the emperor's preferences and moods, trying to time their appearances to moments when he might be most receptive. But they also had to be careful not to appear too ambitious or too clever. as the emperor was suspicious of women who seemed to have political motivations. The balance required was almost impossible to maintain, and most concubines lived their entire lives in the palace without ever speaking to the emperor. The palace women who did bear sons faced an even more complex situation. Their children became potential heirs, which made them valuable but also made them targets. Other concubines might try to poison them or their children. Palace officials might try to manipulate them for political purposes. Even the emperor himself might view them with suspicion, fearing that a concubine with a son might try to influence succession politics. Many mothers chose to maintain low profiles, hoping that obscurity would protect both themselves and their children. The imperial kitchens were sites of elaborate security measures and astonishing culinary artistry. Teams of cooks prepared hundreds of dishes for each imperial meal, with multiple versions of each dish prepared by different cooks to prevent poisoning. Food tasters sampled every dish before it was presented to the emperor, and these tasters were themselves closely monitored for any signs of illness or suspicious behavior. The ingredients came from across the empire, with some items requiring weeks of travel to reach the capital. The emperor's meals were not just about sustenance, but about displaying the reach and power of his empire. Rare delicacies from distant provinces, exotic spices from foreign lands, and ingredients that required elaborate preparation were all part of the daily dining ritual. But the emperor, increasingly paranoid about poisoning, often ate very little, sampling dishes randomly and sometimes ordering entire meals destroyed if he detected anything suspicious. The waste was staggering, with enough food prepared each day to feed hundreds of people, most of which was thrown away untouched. The physicians who served the emperor operated in an environment of constant fear. They were expected to keep the emperor healthy and to provide him with elixirs that would extend his life indefinitely. But they were also painfully aware that the treatments the emperor demanded, particularly the mercury-based elixirs, were actively harming him. They faced an impossible choice: tell the emperor the truth and face execution, or continue providing harmful treatments and watch their patient slowly poison himself. Some physicians tried to reduce the mercury content in the elixirs they prepared, hoping the emperor wouldn't notice. Others tried to suggest alternative approaches to achieving longevity, emphasizing diet, exercise, and meditation instead of alchemical substances. But the emperor was convinced that immortality could only be achieved through powerful chemical elixirs, and he insisted on increasingly potent formulations as his health declined. The physicians watched helplessly as their patients' symptoms worsened, knowing that they would likely be blamed for his inevitable death. The court, astrologers, and diviners held significant influence, as the emperor consulted them before making any major decision. These men studied the stars, interpreted dreams, and performed elaborate rituals to determine auspicious dates for important events. But they also understood that their predictions had to align with what the emperor wanted to hear. An astrologer who predicted unfavorable outcomes for imperial projects might find himself accused of spreading discord, or even of cursing the emperor. The most successful diviners learned to phrase their predictions in ways that could be interpreted favorably, regardless of what actually happened. The construction and maintenance of the emperor's multiple palaces required armies of servants and craftsmen. Each palace complex needed to be kept in perfect condition at all times, because the emperor might decide to visit any of them without warning. Furniture had to be polished, gardens maintained, and living quarters prepared as if the emperor lived there permanently, even if he visited only once a year or never at all. The cost of maintaining these empty palaces was enormous, but suggestions that some might be closed or reduced in staff were met with accusations of disloyalty. The palace guards represented another layer of the complex court hierarchy. These men were selected for their loyalty and physical prowess, but they were also chosen from families with no political connections, ensuring they had no alternative loyalties. Guards were rotated frequently and kept under constant surveillance by other guards, creating a system of mutual suspicion that prevented them from organizing any kind of coup. Despite wielding weapons and having physical access to the emperor, the guards were among the most powerless people in the court, knowing that any suspicious behavior would result in the execution of their entire families. The emperor's architects and engineers faced unique challenges in satisfying their patrons' ever-changing demands. The emperor would order the construction of elaborate palaces, then change his mind about their design midway through construction. He would demand that buildings be torn down and rebuilt because he decided the orientation was inauspicious, or because he had a dream that suggested a different layout. The architects learned to build in ways that allowed for easy modification, but this flexibility came at enormous cost in materials and labor. The most tragic figures in the court were perhaps the scholars and historians who were tasked with recording the emperor's reign for posterity. These men had been educated in the classical texts that the emperor had ordered burned, and they understood the irony of documenting a reign that had tried to eliminate documentation of previous reigns. They had to present the emperor's actions in the most favorable light possible while maintaining enough historical accuracy that their work would be credible to future generations. The tension between truth and propaganda haunted every word they wrote. These scholars knew that they were creating a historical record that would shape how future generations understood their time. But they also knew that any hint of criticism could result in their deaths. They developed subtle ways of embedding truth within officially sanctioned narratives, using language that seemed complimentary on the surface, but contained coded criticism for those who knew how to read between the lines. Some of these scholars may have hoped that future historians would understand their true messages, but they could never be certain their subtlety would be recognized. The foreign envoys who visited the imperial court provided fascinating perspectives on the regime's operation. These diplomats came from various neighboring kingdoms and had to navigate the elaborate court protocols while also gathering intelligence about the empire's military capabilities and political stability. Their reports, some of which survive in the historical records of other civilizations, describe a court of stunning wealth and sophistication, but also of barely concealed tension and fear. These envoys noted that despite the outward displays of power and confidence, the emperor's officials seemed nervous and uncertain, constantly looking over their shoulders and speaking in guarded terms. They observed that the emperor himself appeared increasingly unstable, sometimes engaging in long, rambling monologues about his achievements, and at other times sitting in complete silence, staring at nothing. These outsider perspectives provide valuable confirmation of the psychological atmosphere that dominated the court during the emperor's final years. The collapse of the court after the emperor's death was swift and brutal. The carefully constructed system of control, held together by fear of the emperor's authority, disintegrated within months. Officials who had worked together for decades turned on each other in desperate attempts to secure power, or simply to survive. The concubines who had hoped their sons might become emperor found themselves pawns in political struggles they couldn't control. The eunuchs, who had wielded so much informal power, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to officials who had resented their influence for years. Li Si, the brilliant administrator who had done so much to create the imperial system, was eventually executed by Xiao Gao, the chief eunuch he had worked with for years. The method of execution was particularly brutal, demonstrating that the culture of cruelty the emperor had created continued after his death. The second emperor, who had been installed through political manipulation rather than legitimate succession, proved weak and ineffective, unable to maintain the control his father had exercised. Within 4 years of the first emperor's death, the dynasty he had worked so hard to establish was overthrown, and many of the officials who had served him were killed in the resulting chaos. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most fascinating and disturbing discoveries. The Terracotta Army will continue to reveal its secrets for generations to come. But the human stories behind it, the workers who created it, the emperor who commissioned it, and the officials who made it possible. These stories remind us that history is not just about dates and artifacts, but about the eternal human struggle between creativity and destruction, between the desire for immortality and the reality of mortality. I hope you found this exploration both enlightening and peaceful. As always, thank you for being part of our community here at Boring History for Sleep. Your engagement, your comments, and your continued support make it possible for us to explore these incredible historical stories together. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply taking a quiet moment to learn something new, you're an essential part of what we do here. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next episode, where we'll continue our journey through the fascinating, forgotten corners of human history.